So this is not the newest of news, but it is a incredibly consequential story, I think. And it is one of those stories that feels like, A, it's illustrative of a much wider trend, but also is illustrative of something which will continue to have a big impact. So back in February, Vice announced that it was going to be shutting down its own website, so vice.com, and laying off a whole bunch of staff, which it was not alone in doing. There was, or have been, during the first part of this year, a considerable number of media layoffs. In fact, Al Jazeera has a story about this today. Journalists are calling it a bloodbath. The US media industry has been decimated by some of the worst layoffs in decades. And lots of people are asking these big questions in terms of where there is being layoffs like across the whole industry, or, is this something much larger? But Vice feels really interesting to me. So there's a bunch of people in the chat kind of talking about how cool Vice was at one point, right? Vice was like a real kind of cultural phenomenon, both in its writing and in its audio-visual stuff. It felt really distinctive. And for a time, there was a feeling that media companies like Vice were likely to be this injection of new energy into news media. And it's probably right to say that there were sort of three companies which emerged around a similar time, which all felt like they had a similar thing going for them. We had Vice, we had BuzzFeed, which gets a bad rep. BuzzFeed will always be remembered for its kind of lowest common denominator stuff, and that's maybe fair. A lot of it was listicles and quizzes about which friend are you, but eventually they launched a news vertical, and BuzzFeed News was actually pretty good. In 2021, BuzzFeed News won the Pulitzer Prize for international reporting for its coverage of the internment camps as a part of China's campaign against Muslim Uyghurs. There was important news that was published in BuzzFeed News that was like broken by BuzzFeed News. The third, I would say, was probably Vox, which again kind of felt like it did something maybe less different than the other two, and yet similarly was a kind of media first company and also did a different kind of journalism. And I think the different kinds of journalism that all three of those media organizations did were also different to each other, but also felt really unique in comparison to traditional, like, legacy media outlets, such as, whether it's The Guardian or The New York Times or The Times or any of those publications with much longer legacies to them. And those three organizations, and I'm sure some of you can name others as well, felt really exciting. Vice, Vox, and BuzzFeed all made or make kind of news and current affairs content for a primarily youth audience. However, did so in a way that didn't feel like it was dumbing down or talking down. Vice and BuzzFeed and Vox kind of felt like they were doing something that was a little bit different. Vox's whole thing was this idea of explainer journalism, which has been like deeply influential. Like most video essays on YouTube are in some way descendant from Vox's form of explainer journalism, where rather than just reporting on a thing that is happening in the news, there is the kind of step back of going, and we're going to explain why that matters and how that works, etc. So rather than just going, interest rates have gone up today, if Vox want to do an article about that or make a video about that, they will do this thing where they go, actually, we're going to place it into all this context and explain what an interest rate is and why they go up and down and what the consequences of that are, in a way that most newspapers don't really take the time to do. They just go, interest rates are going up. And I guess they might say some of the consequences, but when they won't give as much weight to context as Vox tends to do. BuzzFeed just had this fascinating relationship with BuzzFeed proper, the kind of like listicles and stuff. They had this just interesting business model where all the quizzes and the listicles and the sort of nonsense was helping to pay for some kind of interesting journalism that didn't feel overly serious. And then Vice just had this like very gonzo, very first person approach to the news. One thing you'll continue to look, just looking down Vice's YouTube channel now, you see so many eyes in the title of videos, right? It's the abuse I witnessed in the care industry. I make $60K a month smuggling Californian weed into New York. But there was always this sense with with Vice articles and Vice videos that it was I am doing something, right? There was like a cheeky element to it. They never took themselves too seriously. There was often like a dangerous element to some of them as well. There was also this kind of like flip-flop between stuff that was really serious, like going to war zones, paired with stuff that was really silly. Some of you will know Uber Butler, who worked for Vice for a bunch of time. But there was this really sense of like this kind of gonzo journalism. It was usually a youngish journalist who was doing something a little bit cheeky or was doing something incredibly serious and a little bit dangerous. Almost the accepted wisdom was that they were going to change the way that news media was made, that it was published, and that it was engaged with. Right, that they were just going to come in and do things really differently. And yet what's interesting is what's happened now is that Vice and BuzzFeed have both folded, and Vox is the only one that is left. Like this Al Jazeera article was saying that we looked at a moment ago, some of it is related to like private equity companies and venture capitalists who kind of bought some of all of these, not just these three, but these kind of young insurgent media companies, and bought in and wanted them to achieve kind of completely unsustainable growth. Some of it is related to like Facebook's pivot to video thing. There was this whole scandal a few years ago where Facebook had encouraged lots of media organizations to start uploading videos natively to Facebook because it wanted to compete with YouTube. And it basically turned out, with the idea that this could become profitable in the same way that posting videos to YouTube can. And basically, Facebook were just making up their numbers. Facebook basically just massively inflated the numbers by which people were watching videos, and they'd spent ages telling media companies that people really want to be watching videos, and because the numbers were being inflated, outlets thought they were getting lots of people watching their stuff on Facebook, and so they were investing money into making better stuff. As Clarence Radisson said, Facebook killed cracked with that. And so these are massive parts of it as well. But I think one of the underlying problems that I think we're going to face in terms of the direction that media goes in the future is that people at large don't seem to want to pay up front for getting the news. There are some people who do so, right? And there are some newspapers that will thrive because of that. So the Financial Times, for example, has an extraordinarily expensive paywall. But other organizations have tried to go in other directions. And The Guardian, for example, is currently losing a lot of money because it tried to go down this different route of allowing everyone to have free access and having adverts and asking people to contribute if they want to, and it doesn't appear to have worked. And there's other factors around that I've talked about previously in terms of its weird political positioning these days, and the fact that the particular kind of middle class progressive audience that it used to go for just doesn't exist in quite the same way anymore. It's also become really transphobic and very anti-left, and I think that has affected it as well because it's kind of limited its audience a bit. So there's a lot else that's going on there as well. But broadly speaking, people are happy to have adverts around the stuff they engage with, but people en masse don't seem to want to pay for their news. But one of the challenges is that doing proper news reporting is incredibly expensive. Being in the position where you are breaking the news, in the sense that you are literally revealing new information to the public because you've spoken to the right person, or you've been contacted by the right person, or you've come across the right document, etc. That is really, really expensive, to the point where it might not be super profitable on the business models that we've currently got and that are currently thriving. And we can kind of see the consequences of this in a kind of interesting way with this trio of Vice, BuzzFeed, and Vox. Because whilst there was obviously also a whole bunch of other stuff that was going on with those organizations, one difference is that Vice and BuzzFeed were both doing some form of news gathering. But what Vox does is something slightly different. Because Vox does this explainer journalism stuff, which is like, it's very good at, and I think is very much a public good, where their focus is always on these explainers, right? Which is kind of at one remove from directly breaking the news, if that makes sense. You are unlikely to find on Vox a story where it's like, this thing happens and you didn't know that this happened and no one knew this happened before you read this article. What they do is the stuff where it's one step back of that explainer, taking that broader view. And I think this is super important. I think it's super good. I think the influence it's had has been fantastic. But one key thing about that is that is much cheaper to do, because there's so much less wasted time. Basically, you can have writers who are always writing stuff, and the stuff they are writing is always used. Whereas, if you're a Vice Media or a BuzzFeed News, or in fact any traditional news outlet like The Guardian or the New York Times or whoever else, you spend a lot of time paying people to do stuff which might have zero consequences. And I think that's going to be the real challenge going forwards, because this kind of stuff isn't profitable. Very few legacy media organizations continue to make an ongoing healthy profit, which leaves us in this position where stuff like Vox, which again is really great at what it does, is in many ways the thing that I do, right? This kind of thing is financially viable. However, this kind of thing relies on someone else doing this. The explainery stuff relies on someone else already doing the news gathering stuff, right? We'll find ourselves in a position, I fear, that even when stuff like this exists, that it's largely reliant on the reporting done by news organizations which are owned by millionaires and billionaires, and therefore that means that it's those outlets which are owned by the millionaires and the billionaires and the corporate interests, whatever, that are able to shape what the basic information that something like a Vox or name your favorite explainer journalist here are able to create. So it doesn't matter if it's possible to have a progressive layer in the sense of a Vox or a whoever else, because the raw material that they're working with, which is the unprofitable bit, potentially ends up being owned by the people that can afford and are interested in owning a media organization for the sake of having some control over the distribution of information. And I think that's where things get potentially really worrying.